She arrived when the sun had already dropped behind the Rockies and the long shadow of the mountains stretched across the unnamed dirt road like something trying to hold her back. Grace Holloway pulled a small trunk behind her, bound with rope, because the latch had broken somewhere between Missoula and the bus stop at the edge of Garfield County. She carried a cloth bag of clothes over one shoulder and kept her right hand pressed flat against her chest, where a folded handkerchief held the last of what 7 years of other people's work had left her. 24 years old, a widow for 10 months, and not a single person in the state of Montana who was expecting her. The man at the county office in Harlow had described the road to the property as easy to find. That is the way people who know a place talk to people who do not. It means the road exists on no map, that the last quarter mile is more suggestion than path, and that only someone who already knows where they are going has any real chance of arriving. Grace had walked the final stretch with the trunk scraping along loose rock, the October sun still heavy on the back of her neck, despite what the calendar claimed about autumn, and the feeling that she was walking towards something she had not yet been given permission to understand. The farmhouse appeared at the end of the road, the way abandoned things appear without announcement, without welcome, simply there. The walls were whitewashed stone, though the whitewash had peeled in long strips that curled away from the surface like old skin. The roof sagged on the north side where the weight of too many Montana winters had pressed it down with the patience of something that does not hurry because it knows it will eventually win. The wooden door at the front had swollen with moisture and sat in its frame at an angle neither fully open nor fully closed, like a question that had been asked and not yet answered. And on the other side of the low stone fence that bordered the yard, 4 goats stood watching her with the particular calm of animals that have seen too many people come down that same road and learn not to expect anything useful from any of them. Grace stopped. She did not move toward the house or toward the fence. She stood at the edge of the property and let the first impressions settle before deciding what to do with it. She had learned that much from 7 years of service in other people's houses, that the first thing you feel about a place is often the truest thing you will ever feel about it, and that it deserves a moment of honest attention before the practical mind takes over and begins making lists. The place was small, but it was solid. The stone had come from the mountains and had been laid by someone who understood that this part of Montana did not forgive shortcuts. The fence around the pen was stacked fieldstone, no mortar, just weight and balance. The well in the yard had a rope tangled in the pulley. The grapevine that covered the arch above the front path had gone uncut for what looked like years, its branches crossing each other in every direction, like a person who has forgotten where they were going and stopped caring. Grace looked at all of it with the slow attention of someone taking inventory without hurry, and thought that she had seen worse, and that worse than all of it was having nothing to look at. She had bought this place on a Tuesday in October in a notary's office in Harlow that smelled of old wood and ink. 2 witnesses had been brought in from the sidewalk by the notary himself, a practical man who understood that some transactions happen quickly and that witnesses do not need to be invested parties. Neither of them had looked Grace in the eye. Walter Crane's 3 nephews, who had driven down from Billings in a car that cost more than the land they were selling, had passed the deed across the table with the efficiency of men who had already decided what they thought of the whole business. The eldest folded the bank check without counting. It nodded once with the kind of gratitude that does not contain any actual feeling, and all 3 of them left in a cloud of red dust that hung in the narrow street long after the sound of the engine had gone. Grace had stood on the sidewalk with the copy of the deed in her hand and felt the weight of it. Not the paper, the decision. She had spent nearly everything she had on a place she had never seen in a county she had no history with, based on a letter from a man she had not spoken to in 2 years. She had read that letter 3 times the morning it arrived, sitting at the table in the back room of the laundry in Missoula, where she had been working since leaving Billings. Frank Delaney, who had worked the same ranch as Daniel before the wedding, had written to say, almost as an aside, between other news, that there was a small property in Garfield County whose heirs were looking to sell fast and at a price that reflected their disinterest rather than the land's value. He had meant it as information, not as advice. Grace had read it as both. The price was low enough that there had to be a story behind it. That was the thought she had, sitting in the back room with the smell of steam and clean linen around her. And the story, when she had made a few careful inquiries through Frank and through the county assessor's public records, turned out to be the oldest kind people who inherit what they did not want and convert their indifference into a number on a page. The nephews had lives in the city. They had no use for 40 acres of dry Montana grassland and a herd of 4 goats. They wanted the transaction finished before winter. Grace had read the letter a 4th time. Then she had done the arithmetic that her head had been refusing to authorize since the moment Roy Holloway had slid a piece of paper across the kitchen table in Billings and told her, without quite saying it, that her time in his house had run its natural course. She had been in Roy's house for 10 months by then, 10 months since the August morning when Daniel had stopped breathing, the pneumonia having done in his lungs what 3 weeks of fever and 2 doctors had not managed to prevent. Roy was Daniel's older brother, 34 years old, a man of measured gestures and careful silences, the kind of person who never says the cruel thing directly because he has learned that indirection is more effective and leaves less evidence. The meals had grown quieter week by week. The comments about the house being crowded had begun small and grown consistent. The absences at moments when presence would have cost nothing but meant everything had accumulated into a pattern that Grace had finally recognized for what it was: not expulsion, but a steady erosion of the conditions that make staying possible. She had understood by the time the last month came that remaining in Roy's house meant remaining in a place where she was tolerated but did not belong. That understanding had not made the evening any easier when he finally set the paper in front of her. He had done the accounting carefully, 10 months of room and board calculated at a rate he had apparently researched, subtracted from the small life insurance payment Daniel had left, which had itself been smaller than either of them had hoped, because Daniel had only converted the policy to a permanent one 8 months before he died. What remained after Roy's subtraction was enough for a bus ticket and 3 months of careful living. Roy had not looked at her when he pushed the paper across the table. He had looked at the wall above her shoulder, and in that small avoidance, Grace had understood something about the difference between cruelty and calculation. Cruelty has heat in it. What Roy had done was cold, and the cold was worse. She had left without a scene. She had taken her trunk and her bag and the handkerchief with what remained of her savings, and she had gone because she had known for months that the door was already open and that staying any longer would only mean pretending she did not see it. Frank's letter had arrived 6 weeks later. She had read it 3 times, then a 4th, and then she had put it in her coat pocket and gone back to work, and for 3 days she had done nothing with the thought except carry it around. On the 4th morning she had written to the county assessor. By the end of the week she had made her decision. The price was low enough to be alarming. She had told herself that on the bus ride down, watching the flatlands give way to the rougher country of the eastern ranges. But she had also told herself something else, that the low price was not a warning so much as an explanation, and that an explanation is a thing you can work with, which is more than she had in Billings. Now she stood at the edge of the property and let the decision settle into the ground beneath her feet. She moved toward the fence. The 4 goats watched her approach with the collective stillness of creatures who had long ago exhausted their capacity for surprise. The oldest one, a gray doe with long coarse fur and ears that drooped at the tips, stood in the center of the pen and did not shift her weight or change her expression. 2 younger does moved to the fence out of something that was probably curiosity rather than trust. The male, a solid animal with horns that curved slightly inward at the tips, continued eating from the corner of the pen without acknowledging Grace's existence. The feed trough was empty. The stone water trough was low and dark with sediment. Grace did not know anything about goats. She had grown up in towns, worked in houses, and the closest she had come to livestock was the milk delivery that arrived at the back door of the Caldwell household in Helena every Tuesday and Friday morning. But she understood thirst without needing an education in it, and she understood that these animals had been without water for at least a day, possibly 2. She looked around the pen and found a feed sack leaning against the far wall, half empty, its mouth knotted with the hasty tie of someone who had left in a hurry and not expected to be gone long. She opened it, filled the trough, and then turned her attention to the well. The rope had wound itself around the pulley bracket in a way that suggested someone had lowered the bucket in haste and not brought it back up properly. Grace worked the tangle free with both hands, her fingers cold from the October air, and lowered the bucket 3 times until the stone water trough was full. She stepped back from the fence and watched the goats drink. The old doe moved to the trough first. The others waited, not because anyone had taught them to wait, but because the order of things in that small pen had been established long before Grace arrived and required no instruction to observe. The old doe drank slowly, without urgency, with a dignity that the others respected, by keeping their distance until she had finished. When she lifted her head and stepped back, her eyes found Grace for a moment with an expression that communicated nothing and somehow communicated everything. Grace stood there and thought that there was something familiar in that animal, in the way she occupied the center of her small world with the certainty of a creature that had stopped asking for permission. She could not have named what she recognized. She only knew that she recognized it. The first night was long, in the way that first nights in unfamiliar places are always long, every sound requiring classification before the body is willing to accept it as harmless. Grace swept the packed earth floor with the broom she found behind the door, shook out the wool mattress on the iron bed frame, and opened the small window that faced the pen to let the night air come through. She ate, sitting at the rough wooden table, bread and a piece of sausage she had wrapped in wax paper and carried from the bus station in Harlow, and she looked around the inside of the farmhouse the way she had looked at the outside, with slow attention without rushing the inventory. There was a stone fireplace in the main room with old ash that the wind had scattered across the floor in a gray fan. A wooden cabinet held 2 clay pots, a pitcher without a handle, and an oil lamp with its wick still intact. The window on the north wall had a broken shutter that the wind moved on a slow, regular beat like something keeping time. And then there was the wall behind the fireplace. Grace had not noticed it immediately. She had been looking at the room the way you look at a room you are trying to understand, moving her attention from corner to corner, cataloging what was there and estimating what would need to be done. But when she carried the oil lamp toward the fireplace to look at the chimney, the light caught the back wall at an angle and she stopped. There was a section of plaster there that was different from the rest, slightly lighter in color with a surface texture that did not quite match the surrounding wall, as if someone had applied it after the original coat had long since dried and settled. It was not large, perhaps 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall, beginning just above the height of the fireplace mantel and extending toward the corner. Grace set the lamp on the mantel and pressed her fingers flat against the surface. It felt solid. She tapped it once with her knuckle, and the sound came back different from the wall on either side, not hollow exactly, but with a resonance beneath it, as though the stone behind the plaster had been shaped to contain something rather than simply to stand. She did not reach for the small pickaxe she had noticed hanging in the shed when she came in. Not that night. She stood with her hand against the wall for a long moment, looking at the lamp flame move in the draft from the broken shutter, and she let the question settle into the same part of her mind where she had learned to keep things she knew she would need later. She turned down the lamp and lay on the mattress in her clothes and listened to the goats settle in the pen outside, and she did not sleep for a long time, and when she finally did, the wall was still the last thing she was thinking about. She was up before the light. The old doe had begun her morning complaint, a low rhythmic sound that carried through the open window with the precision of an alarm that runs on biological time rather than springs and gears. Grace pulled on her boots, went to the well, and washed her face with water so cold it erased the confusion of half-sleep in a single shock. She fed the goats before she made her own breakfast. The feed sack had maybe 2 days left in it, 3 if she was careful. After that, she would need to find a solution. She was standing in the pen trying to understand the scope of the broken shutter problem when she heard a voice on the other side of the outer fence, a woman's voice with the kind of steadiness that comes from having spent a long life in a place where the wind requires you to speak clearly or not bother speaking at all. The woman at the fence was perhaps 65, with white hair pinned at the back of her neck, and a black apron over a dark dress. She was carrying an enameled tin with a check cloth folded over the top. She said her name was Eleanor Marsh, though she said it the way people say names they have had long enough that the formality has worn off, so that what came out was Nell. She said she kept the place up the road past the big oak, that she had known Walter Crane for over 20 years, and that she had heard about the new owner from the mail carrier, who knew everything first in small towns because he looked at envelopes even when he did not open them. They sat on the front step with the tin of black bean soup between them and ate with wooden spoons, and the conversation that came was the kind that sometimes exists only between people with no shared history to get in the way of the present. Nell talked about Walter Crane with the direct affection of someone who had lived alongside a person for a long time without idealizing them. A man of few words and long memory, she said. He had kept goats on this property since he was young, and he knew things about them that most people do not know about anything. The old doe, she said, was called Rosie. Walter had named her when she was a kid, just weaned, and had never called her anything else. The male with the curved horns was good breeding stock and worth more than the sale price of the entire property if the new owner knew what to do with him. The two young does, if they made it to summer in good condition, would give enough milk to make cheese that sold well at the county market. Grace listened with the attention of someone taking notes without paper. When Nell stood to leave the empty tin under her arm, she said she would come back in the morning to begin teaching what needed to be taught. Grace watched her figure move away down the stone path and felt something she could not name immediately. It resembled relief, but it was warmer than relief usually is. Then she noticed it, the hesitation. When Nell had mentioned Dale Whitmore in passing, just a name dropped into a sentence about the county and the surrounding properties, something in her posture had changed for half a second. Not enough for most people to catch, enough for Grace, who had spent 7 years reading rooms and the people in them, to notice. Nell had moved past the name quickly, too quickly, the way people move past things they have decided not to carry into a new conversation. Grace did not ask. It was not the time, but she filed it away in the same careful part of her mind where she had filed the wall behind the fireplace. That afternoon, when the goats were quiet in the pen and the light had begun its long October descent through the stands of cottonwood along the fence line, Grace went into the shed and took down the small pickaxe that hung on a nail above the workbench. She worked the wall beside the fireplace slowly, without forcing it, paying attention to what gave and what held. The plaster came away in small chips that fell to the earth floor with a dry, clean sound. Behind it, cut into the stone, was a space, not a crack or a flaw in the construction, a deliberate cavity roughly the size of a small toolbox with edges too clean to be accidental. Inside the cavity was a wooden box with a dark, almost black finish. Its lid fitted snugly without a lock. Grace lifted it out carefully, wiped it with the hem of her apron, and opened it on the table under the oil lamp drawn close. Inside were papers folded with care, each one creased along lines that suggested they had been folded and unfolded many times over many years. She took them out one at a time and laid them flat on the table and read them in the order she found them. There were property documents, a deed of title more detailed than the one used in the recent sale describing the land's boundaries with a precision that included features the simplified version had omitted. There was a ledger, its pages dense with the small, tight handwriting of someone who had little formal schooling, but understood that numbers do not lie if you write them down correctly. Every payment, every tax receipt, every contribution to the county assessor going back decades, each one dated and cross-referenced with a filing number. And at the bottom of the box, folded separately, there was a heavier document with an official seal from the Garfield County Notary, dated 32 years before. Grace read it once, then she read it again. It was a water rights concession. It described with exact survey coordinates a natural spring located at the southern edge of the property adjacent to the Slate Rock Formation, and it granted exclusive rights of use to the title holder and their successors in perpetuity. The spring had been registered by Walter Crane with the county court, witnessed and signed by two parties whose names and addresses were recorded in full. In eastern Montana, in seasons when the summer ran longer than the sky had any right to promise, water that did not depend on rain had no market price because it existed above what the market could reach. There were ranches in this county that had fought legal battles for years over creek access and well rights. There were families who had sold land at a loss because the water table had dropped and they had no alternative source. This spring was not a convenience. It was something closer to bedrock, and it belonged to Grace Holloway. She sat at the table with the document in her hands and looked at the lamp flame moving in the draft from the broken shutter, and she thought about the three nephews folding their check without counting it and driving away in their cloud of red dust. And she thought about the notary who had brought two witnesses in from the street, and she thought about Frank Delaney's letter and the word undervalued that he had used almost as an afterthought. She closed the box and placed it carefully in the trunk she had pushed to the corner of the bedroom. She stood with her hand resting on the dark wood for a moment. She had arrived with almost nothing, and the land she had bought was holding more than anyone had thought to look for. 3 days later, on a Saturday evening, when the last light was leaving the sky in long horizontal bands of orange above the western peaks, a 14-year-old boy on a bicycle came down the road to the property. He laid an envelope on the top of the fence post without opening the gate, then turned his bike around and pedaled away at a pace that made clear he had been told to deliver and not to wait. Grace called after him, asking his name. He did not stop. He pedaled faster. She took the envelope from the post. The handwriting on the outside was confident, the kind of hand that has spent a lifetime signing things. Inside was a letter from a man named Dale Whitmore. The letter was written in the language of legal formality, dressed up as concern. It stated that there existed an outstanding property tax liability on the farmstead generated during the tenure of the previous owner, which had not been resolved prior to the transfer of title, and that under applicable county statutes, this obligation passed to the new title holder. The amount the letter noted was considerable. It further stated that there was a buyer prepared to acquire the property at the price Grace had paid, plus any associated costs she had incurred, provided the transaction was concluded before the matter of the debt reached the county court. Grace read to the end. She folded the letter along its original crease and placed it in the pocket of her apron. Then she went inside and sat at the table under the lamp and opened Walter Crane's ledger and began reading from the first page. The entries went back 24 years. Walter had noted every tax payment with a receipt number, a date, the name of the county collector who had processed it, and the cancellation stamp reference. The handwriting was consistent throughout, the same tight, careful script of a man who had not trusted his memory and had understood that paper outlasts people if it is kept correctly. There was no outstanding debt, or if there had ever been one, it had been settled, and the receipt was there between the pages of the ledger, its collector's signature and cancellation mark, as clear as the day it was written. Grace pressed her finger against the ink of one such stamp and sat looking at the lamp flame for a long time. The debt in Whitmore's letter did not exist, but paper from a man with influence in the county court was still paper, and paper could cause damage if she did not know how to answer it. She did not sleep much that night. Around 2 in the morning, she put on her coat, tucked the ledger and the water rights document inside her clothing against her chest, and walked out into the cold October dark toward the road that led past the big oak to Rosemary Creek. Nell's kitchen light was still on. It was on most nights, Nell would tell her later, because she had reached the age where sleep was a negotiation rather than a certainty. Nell opened the door, looked at Grace's face, and stepped aside without asking a single question. The fire in Nell's kitchen had burned down to coals by the time Grace finished speaking, and neither of them moved to add more wood. Nell had listened the way Grace had come to understand. She listened to everything, without interruption, without the small sounds of sympathy that most people insert to signal they are paying attention. She simply sat with her hands flat on the kitchen table and her eyes on Grace's face, and when Grace placed the water rights document and the ledger open to its last entry in front of her, Nell read them both without speaking. The kitchen was quiet except for the occasional settling of the house timbers in the cold and the distant sound of something moving through the brush behind the property. When Nell finally looked up, she did not offer comfort. She offered information. She said there was a lawyer in Harlow named Harold Finch, office on the downhill side of the main street above the feed supplier, with a hand-painted sign that had been there long enough to need repainting. A man well past 60, she said, who had the uncommon quality of not needing to know who you were before deciding whether to hear you out. What mattered to him was the paper. If the paper was in order, he would listen. And there was one other thing, Nell said, and the way she said it told Grace that this was the part she had been building toward. Harold Finch had no connection to Dale Whitmore. In Garfield County in 1952, that fact was worth more than his credentials. Grace looked at Nell across the table and asked the question she had been holding since the first afternoon. She asked how Nell knew so much about Whitmore. The silence that followed was different from Nell's usual silences. It had weight in it. Nell looked at the dark window above the sink for a moment. Then she set both hands flat on the table and told Grace about Robert Marsh. 15 years ago, Nell and her husband had owned a property 3 miles west, 312 acres with a creek running through the lower pasture, good grazing land, the kind of place that had taken them the better part of their working lives to build into something that could sustain them. Robert had been a careful man, not a wealthy one, and in the late 1930s, during the dry years, he had taken a short-term loan against the property to get through a bad season. The loan was legitimate. The terms were written and Robert had paid it back within 18 months. What happened after that was not about the loan. Whitmore had been expanding at the time, buying up parcels on the western side of the county, consolidating his water access along the creek system. Robert's land sat between two properties Whitmore had already acquired, and the creek that ran through the lower pasture was the connecting link. Whitmore had approached Robert twice with offers, and Robert had declined twice. Then the letters started. A county assessor's notice about a disputed boundary survey, a claim from a neighboring title holder about an easement that had allegedly never been properly recorded, a filing in the county court from a creditor Robert had never heard of, asserting a lien based on paperwork that turned out to have been filed by an attorney whose office shared a building with Whitmore's land management company. Robert had not known how to fight it. He had not understood that the individual pieces were coordinated, or that the goal was not to win any particular legal argument, but to generate enough confusion and expense that selling became the easier path. By the time he found a lawyer willing to take the case, the legal fees had consumed what the family had set aside for the next 2 years, and the county court date was still 6 months away. Robert Marsh had died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in February, 4 months before the court date. He was 58 years old and had not slept more than 4 hours in a night for the previous 8 months. Nell had sold the property 3 weeks after the funeral at a price she did not name to cover the remaining legal costs. She had used what was left to buy the 40 acres at Rosemary Creek. She had been there ever since. Walter Crane, she said, had been the only person in the county who had shown up at the funeral without being asked and stayed afterward to help move the furniture into storage. He had not been a man who expressed sympathy in words. He had expressed it by being present and by remembering and by keeping his gate open to Nell in the years that followed without ever making a point of it. Grace sat with this for a moment. Then she understood something she had not understood before, something about why Walter Crane had sealed those papers behind the fireplace wall rather than leaving them in a drawer. He had known or suspected that the nephews would sell without looking carefully at what they were selling. He had known or suspected what that land was worth to the wrong kind of buyer, and he had prepared for the person who came next, whoever that turned out to be, by making sure the most important documents were protected and findable to someone who paid attention. Walter Crane had never met Grace Holloway. He had left her everything she needed anyway. She walked back to the farmhouse before dawn with the water rights document and the ledger tucked inside her coat, and she went to sleep for 3 hours, and when Rosie's morning complaint came through the window, she rose and pulled on her boots with the particular kind of resolve that comes not from certainty, but from the absence of any acceptable alternative. Nell arrived at the farmhouse 2 hours after sunrise, wearing a straw hat and carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder. She walked directly to the pen without preamble, opened the gate, and stood in the center of the enclosure, looking at each of the 4 goats in turn, with the quiet assessment of someone who has done this long enough that the animals know the difference between a stranger's attention and an expert's. She began to teach. She showed Grace how to check the udder, pressing gently along the base to feel for heat or firmness that would indicate a problem before it became visible. She showed her the correct grip for milking the rhythm of it, the way the pressure needed to be even and forward rolling rather than pulling, and how to stop before the doe's patience ran out rather than after. She explained the feed rationing, how much dry hay mixed with what proportion of grain supplement, and why overfeeding in the short term costs more in the long run than a moderate daily portion consistently maintained. She showed Grace the manure management, how to clear the pen with a method rather than a reaction, stacking the waste in the far corner where it would break down into something the kitchen garden could use. Grace had not known she had a kitchen garden. It turned out to be a walled rectangle on the east side of the farmhouse, invisible from the road, half buried under 3 years of volunteer growth that had moved in after Walter Crane had stopped being able to manage it. Rosie required 3 days before she would stand still for Grace. The first morning she moved away every time Grace came within reaching distance, not with hostility, but with the deliberate redirection of an animal that has not yet formed an opinion and is not prepared to be rushed into one. The second morning she held her position, but kept her head turned, tracking Grace's movements from a distance that said she was present but not committed. On the third morning she stood quietly while Grace worked with the particular stillness of a creature that has made a private decision and is acting on it without explanation. Nell was watching from the fence rail when it happened. She said only that Rosie had chosen, and that when an old doe chose someone, it was because that person had passed some tests they had not known they were taking. The 2 younger does had no such reserve. By the second day, they were pushing their muzzles against Grace's sleeve whenever she came through the gate. She found herself naming them without deciding to the names arriving through repetition of observation rather than invention. The restless one who moved in short bursts and was always the last to settle in. The evening became Fidget, the one who stayed within 3 feet of Rosie at nearly all times, who seemed to measure her own safety by proximity to the older animal, became Shadow. On the 4th day, the feed ran out. Grace walked to Cooper's Feed and Supply on the county road, 40 minutes each way with Nell beside her, in the way Nell accompanied things, without being asked, without comment, simply there. Ed Cooper was behind the counter when they came in, a man in his late 50s with the measuring look of someone who has learned to size up a situation before committing to a response. He looked at Grace, then at Nell, then back at Grace. He said in a voice that was neither warm nor cold, but occupied the careful middle ground of a man assessing risk in real time, "You're the one who bought the Crane place." Grace said she was. He said, "Whitmore, know you're out there." Grace told him Whitmore had been in contact. Something moved across Ed Cooper's face, then a calculation she could see him working through. He looked at the counter between them. He looked at Nell. He said he would put it on the books, and he wrote her name in the ledger with a deliberateness that told Grace the ledger entry was also a kind of declaration and that he knew it. She walked back to the farmhouse with the feed sack on her back and the feeling of a door having opened onto a hallway whose end she could not yet see. Monday morning, Grace rode the county road into Harlow on the back of a supply cart, the documents held flat against her chest beneath her coat, the small amount of money from 3 mornings of milking folded in her coat pocket. Harold Finch's office was exactly where Nell had described it, above the feed supplier on the downhill side of the main street, the sign weathered to the point of being more suggestion than declaration. The man himself was behind a desk that had more paper on it than clear surface. He was past 70, with a face that had settled into permanent precision and eyes that moved over everything with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had learned early that detail was where cases were won and lost. He listened to Grace with his hands folded on the desk in front of him, not moving, not interjecting his attention complete, in the way that attention is complete in people who understand that the person talking has already done the most important work. When she finished, he took the documents. He went through the ledger page by page, cross-referencing dates against the water rights filing, setting his glasses on his nose, and then removing them, and then setting them back again with the rhythm of deep concentration. He made 2 small notes on a pad beside him. Then he looked up. The tax liability claim was without foundation, he said. The ledger receipts, if authenticated, extinguished any possible claim going back to the period in question. The water rights document was a valid registered title, witnessed and filed correctly at the time. Anyone seeking to dispute it would need to present contradicting documentation to the county court, and he said it with the tone of a man who had already assessed the probability of that documentation existing. He would draft a formal response. Grace asked what he charged. He looked at her for a moment, then he looked at the papers spread across his desk. He said when the matter was resolved, they would discuss a figure, and the figure would be what she could pay at that time. Grace looked at him the way she had learned to look at things she needed to verify before trusting. He did not look away. He did not qualify the statement. He simply waited. She stood and put her hand out. He shook it once briefly and turned back to his desk before she had reached the door. Outside, the October sun was high and direct, and the stone of the main street held the heat in a way that was surprising for the month. Grace stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the warmth settle against her shoulders. It was not relief yet. It was the specific feeling of a necessary action having been taken with what was available, which is a different thing, a more durable thing. She thought about Walter Crane on the walk back to the supply cart. She thought about the 32 years between the day he had filed that water rights document and the day she had found it. She thought about what it meant to spend a lifetime writing things down carefully and then to leave them for someone you would never meet, trusting that the someone would know what to do. That was not an accident. That was faith in the form of documentation. She rode back to the farmhouse and fed the goats and made her supper and did not think about Dale Whitmore for the rest of that evening because he had used up his portion of her attention for the day. 4 days later, a car Grace did not recognize pulled up the road and stopped in front of the gate. The woman who stepped out was perhaps 45, dressed in the careful, restrained way of someone who has spent time in cities and brought the habit back to the country with her. Her name, she said from the other side of the fence, was Margaret Crane. She was Walter's niece. The eldest of the 3 had signed on her behalf with a power of attorney the day of the sale, and she had not been informed of the terms until recently. She said the property had been sold below its reasonable market value, and that she had reason to believe the true value was significantly higher, particularly given certain water access rights she had only recently become aware of. She said she was considering whether the transaction could be contested. Grace listened without changing her expression. Then she said, "Come in, I'll put on coffee." Margaret Crane came through the gate with the posture of a woman who has prepared for a difficult conversation and is slightly thrown by not having it begin the way she expected. Grace poured 2 cups at the kitchen table and then opened Walter Crane's ledger to the page where the sale transaction appeared, and beside it she laid the signed power of attorney that had been part of the original notary filing which Harold Finch had sent back to her with the first round of documents. She did not speak. She set the papers on the table between them and drank her coffee. Margaret looked down at the documents. The signature was her own. The account number into which the payment had been deposited was her own. The date was current. The silence stretched for almost a full minute. Margaret set her cup down. She said she needed time to reconsider certain things. Her voice had changed from when she had come through the gate. The prepared quality was gone from it. She stood, nodded once in a way that contained something Grace chose to read as acknowledgement rather than apology, and walked back to her car. Grace remained at the table with both hands around her cup and listened to the engine sound diminish down the road. Then she became aware of something at the edge of her peripheral vision and looked toward the gate. Tommy Briggs was standing at the fence line. He had his bicycle leaned against the post, and he was watching Margaret Crane's car until it turned out of sight. Grace did not know how long he had been there. When she looked in his direction, he turned immediately and began walking his bike back toward the county road. But in the second before he turned, his face was visible for just a moment, and what was on it was not the blank delivery boy expression he had worn when he dropped Whitmore's letter. It was something more complicated than that, something in the neighborhood of a question he had been carrying for a while and had not yet found the right person to ask. Grace filed that too in the careful part of her mind that was getting full. She did not seek Tommy out directly. What she did was leave a 20-pound feed sack at the fence post with his name written on a piece of brown paper tied to the handle. Nell had mentioned without being asked that the Briggs family had hit a difficult run of seasons, that Tommy's father, Walt, worked 2 of Whitmore's northern parcels on a tenant arrangement, and that the arrangement had not been favorable lately. 3 days later, Tommy appeared at the gate with a wheelbarrow of composted manure from the Whitmore operation's east pasture material that was being thrown out rather than used. He did not offer an explanation for the wheelbarrow, and Grace did not ask for one. She showed him where to put it beside the kitchen garden wall, and then she made 2 cups of coffee and brought them outside and handed him one. He drank it standing up the way young men drink coffee when they are not yet sure whether they are staying. He told her about the water. Whitmore had been diverting the flow from Clancy Creek, the main surface water source on the north side of the county, by extending the earthwork berm on his east property line. The legal justification was irrigation management on his own land. The practical effect was that the volume reaching the downstream parcels, including the 20 acres Walt Briggs farmed under his tenant arrangement, and the properties of 3 other families whose names Tommy counted off on his fingers, had dropped by roughly a third over the past 2 seasons. Nobody had filed a complaint. Walt Briggs could not afford to file a complaint because filing a complaint meant the kind of attention that ended tenant arrangements. The other three families were in variations of the same situation. They were watching what happened with Grace's property. Tommy said, the way you watch a fire, you are not sure which direction it will move. Grace listened to all of it. Then she told him something she had already decided before she knew she would be telling it to him. She said that the water rights Walter Crane had registered 32 years ago were not registered solely for his own use. She said the filing included a community access provision, which meant that neighboring parcels with documented need had the right to petition for access through the county court without requiring her consent, because the provision was built into the original registration. Walter had known, she thought. He had known that controlling the water would eventually mean someone would try to control everything around it, and he had filed the provision as a kind of insurance not just for himself, but for the land around him. Tommy was quiet for a moment. He looked at the empty cup in his hand. He asked her why she was telling him this. Grace thought about Walter Crane's ledger. She thought about 32 years of careful entries and a box sealed behind a fireplace wall and 3 nephews who had sold without looking. She thought about Nell Marsh and the 312 acres and Robert Marsh who had died at 58 without sleeping. She said, because he wrote it down for a reason, and I don't think the reason was only me. Tommy Briggs looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was working through something. Then he said his father would want to know this. Grace said she expected he would. That evening, after Tommy had gone, Grace was in the shed sorting through the tools she had found when she cleaned it out earlier that week. A grubbing hoe with a cracked handle she had repaired with a length of wire and friction tape, a wooden rake missing 2 teeth, 2 large clay crocks and 1 smaller one with dried residue on the interior that smelled faintly of old oil. Nell came by while she was working and stood in the shed doorway looking at the crocks with the assessing expression she used when she was about to tell Grace something useful. She said the 2 large crocks were for cheese. Walter had stopped making it the last few years because he could no longer manage the market run himself, but the milk from the 2 young does, handled correctly, was enough to make a product that sold well at the county fair market in Harlow on the 3rd Saturday of each month. Grace looked at the crocks for a moment. Then she looked at Nell. She said she did not know how to make cheese. Nell said she had not known how to do a great many things before she learned them, and that the learning was the part that stayed with you. The first attempt was too soft. The second split badly during pressing. On the 3rd morning, Grace got the temperature of the milk right before adding the starter culture Nell had brought from her own kitchen, and the curds formed the way Nell had described they should, separating cleanly from the way holding their shape when she moved them to the mold. She set it by the north window where the air was cool and the light was indirect, and she stood looking at it for a moment with her hands still wet from the work. Nell pressed it gently with 2 fingers, the way you test anything you have invested attention in, and said it would do. Grace felt something looking at that small round thing she had made with her own hands that was not quite pride. It was the satisfaction particular to having converted labor into a concrete object, to having followed a process through from its uncertain beginning to something you could touch and smell and know was real. She was standing at the north window checking the cheese the next morning when she heard a vehicle on the road, not the sound of Tommy's bicycle or the supply cart that passed on Tuesday and Friday mornings. A heavier engine moving with the deliberate pace of something that is not in a hurry because it does not need to be. A truck stopped in front of the gate, a large truck, dark green, with the kind of body that said working vehicle rather than farm, used the kind of vehicle that costs more than the average county resident made in 2 years. The man who stepped out was past 50 tall, with the unhurried movements of someone who had spent a long time in rooms where other people waited for him to speak first. He wore a hat and a long canvas work coat, and he moved toward the gate of Grace's property with the particular confidence of a man who has not been told no often enough for the word to carry full weight. He did not knock. He opened the gate and walked in. Grace was at the window when he came through. She set down the cloth she had been using to wipe the cheese mold and walked to the front of the house. Dale Whitmore was standing in her yard. He stood in the yard without apology for having come through the gate, uninvited, the way men stand in spaces they have already decided belong to them before anyone has confirmed the arrangement. Grace walked out from the front of the house and stopped at a distance that was neither confrontational nor retreating. She looked at Dale Whitmore the way she had looked at everything since arriving in Garfield County, with the full, unhurried attention that takes in more than the surface. He was a physically substantial man, but what made him large in the way that mattered was not his height or his build. It was the accumulated habit of being accommodated. It was in the set of his shoulders and the angle of his chin and the particular quality of his silence before he spoke, which was the silence of someone who has learned that other people will fill it if he waits long enough. He said he had come to talk plainly, person to person, and that he thought they could resolve matters without the involvement of courts and lawyers who would take longer and cost more than the situation required. Grace did not respond to that. She waited. He said he had been acquiring land on the western and northern sections of the county for 20 years. He said he understood the water table, the creek systems, the seasonal patterns of the land in a way that took decades to learn, and that this understanding was the basis of a management approach that benefited the county as a whole, whether or not individual landholders appreciated it at the time. He said the spring on the southern edge of her property had been part of a long-term plan that predated her arrival by several years, that he had intended to acquire this parcel directly from Walter Crane's heirs before an outside buyer had entered the picture, and that her purchase, while legally valid, had interrupted something that was larger than 40 acres. Then he named a number. It was nearly twice what Grace had paid, enough, as he framed it, to start cleanly somewhere else with room to breathe and no legal complications following her. Grace let the number sit in the air between them without reacting to it. She looked at the yard around her while he waited for her response. Rosie was standing at the pen gate, watching the exchange with her habitual expression of patient observation. Fidget was moving along the fence line in short, nervous passes. The oak tree at the corner of the yard threw its late morning shadow across the table where the Saturday gathering happened, the cloth still folded on the bench from the previous week. She looked back at Whitmore. She said, "Do you remember Robert Marsh?" The name landed on him the way a stone lands on still water. There was a ripple of something across his face, controlled quickly but not quickly enough. She continued without raising her voice. She said she knew what had happened to the Marsh property 15 years ago. She said she knew the method, the manufactured legal complications, the coordinated filings, the attorney whose office shared a building with Whitmore's land company. She said she knew what it had cost Robert Marsh and what it had cost Nell, and that the knowledge was not something she had sought out as a weapon, but something that had found her anyway, the way the truth of a place finds you if you stay long enough and listen carefully enough. She said Harold Finch had full copies of the water rights registration, including the community access provision that Walter Crane had built into the original filing. She said the provision was a matter of public record at the county court. She said that any attempt to challenge the title manufacture a competing claim or apply the kind of indirect pressure that had worked on Robert Marsh would result in the community access provision becoming the most discussed document in Garfield County, which would mean that every family currently dependent on Whitmore's water management would understand in precise legal terms that they had rights he had been allowing them to forget. She said it all in the same tone she had used since he walked through her gate, not heated, not performed, the flat, caring tone of someone who has thought clearly about what needs to be said and has said it. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. The quality of his silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of a man waiting for other people to fill the space. It was the silence of a man recalculating. He said she was making a mistake. Grace said she did not think so. She said if he wanted to talk further, he was welcome to come back and knock first. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, not with anger exactly, but with the particular expression of a man encountering a situation his experience has not prepared him for. Then he turned, walked back through the gate, and got into his truck. Grace stood in the yard and watched the truck move down the road until the sound of the engine was gone. The air after it left was very quiet. Rosie had not moved from the pen gate during the entire exchange. When Grace turned toward the pen, the old doe was still watching her, and Grace had the distinct impression, as she had had before, with that animal, that something had been witnessed and assessed and found adequate. She went inside and put a pot of water on the stove for coffee. Her hands were steady. That was the thing she noticed most, that her hands were steady, because they had not always been when she thought about Whitmore in the weeks since his letter had arrived. The steadiness was not relief, and it was not triumph. It was something quieter, the feeling of having stood in a place and held it, which is different from winning and closer to simply being real. The letter from Harold Finch arrived on a Tuesday in November, carried by the supply cart driver who had developed the habit of adding a small detour past the farmhouse on his rounds. Grace was in the yard splitting kindling when she heard the cart on the road. The driver handed her the envelope without getting down from the seat, in the manner of a man who has been asked to deliver something and has developed a quiet respect for the person receiving it. She set down the hatchet and opened the envelope standing in the yard. Finch's language was precise and thorough. The tax liability claim had been formally challenged. The county assessor's office, upon review of the ledger receipts submitted as evidence, had confirmed there was no outstanding obligation attached to the property. The claim was dismissed. The water rights document had been entered into the property's official county record. its community access provision noted in full. Margaret Crane's preliminary inquiry regarding the transaction had been withdrawn following review of the authenticated power of attorney documentation. The property belonged to Grace Holloway. No encumbrances, no conditions. She read the letter through to the end and then folded it along its original crease and put it in the pocket of her work coat. She picked up the hatchet and went back to the kindling. The goats were making the sounds of late afternoon, each one with its own register. Rosie's low and unhurried the two young does with their overlapping calls, and she worked through the pile of wood with the same steady rhythm she had been using before the cart arrived, and when she was done, she stacked the kindling against the side of the house and went in to start the stove. She did not mark the moment in any visible way, and she did not feel the absence of a visible marking as a loss. Some things settle into the body rather than expressing outward, and they stay there longer for it. 2 days later, Tommy Briggs came to the gate, this time without the bicycle. He was on foot wearing his good jacket, which Grace recognized as an occasion jacket by the way it did not quite fit his current size, as though it had been bought in anticipation of a version of him still a year or two away. He stood at the gate and told her that his father had read the information about the community access provision. He said Walt Briggs had spoken to 2 of the other 3 families whose names Tommy had counted off on his fingers in the yard a few weeks earlier. He said they were talking carefully and quietly about whether to engage Harold Finch together as a group to file a formal petition through the county court. Grace said that sounded like the right way to proceed. Tommy was quiet for a moment. He had something else he was working up to. She could see it in the way he was holding his hat in both hands in front of him. He asked her something he had apparently been carrying for a while. He asked why she had not taken Whitmore's offer. He said the number had been real enough to go somewhere else and start fresh without the weight of all this on her. He asked it plainly without accusation, the honest question of a young person trying to understand a decision that did not conform to the logic he had been raised around. Grace walked with him down to the southern edge of the property, past the old orchard where the apple trees had gone unpruned for 3 seasons and were starting to reclaim their own shape, past the low stone wall that marked the property's formal boundary, to the slate rock formation where the spring emerged. The water was moving at its normal pace, clear and cold, collecting in the natural basin below the rock face before spreading into the channel that led toward the lower pasture. The ground around the basin was dark and soft, a ring of life in the dry November landscape, with small clusters of sedge grass at the water's edge and the particular green of moss on the north face of the rocks that only grew where moisture was reliable. Grace crouched at the edge and let the water run over her hand the way she had done the first time she came here alone in the January fog. She said, Walter Crane filed that community provision in 1920. He was 41 years old. He had been on this land for 11 years by then, and he understood what the water meant, not just to himself, but to every parcel around him. He could have registered it privately. He chose not to. She stood. She said, he didn't leave that box behind the fireplace for someone who would sell the first time someone put a number in front of her. Tommy looked at the spring for a long moment. He nodded once in the way of someone who has received an answer that answers more than the question he asked. Then he put his hat back on and said his father would be writing to Harold Finch that week. After Tommy left, Grace walked back through the orchard slowly. She stopped at one of the apple trees and looked at it properly for the first time. The branches had crossed and rubbed in places where they needed to be opened up, and there were water shoots coming off the main limbs that would take energy without producing fruit, but the tree itself was sound. The root system was decades old and the trunk was solid. The neglect of 3 years had not killed it. It had only complicated it. She thought she would learn to prune apple trees in the spring. Winter came early to Garfield County that year. The mornings brought frost on the penstones by the first week of December, and the oak along the fence line dropped the last of its leaves before Nell said it usually did. Grace learned the specific character of a Montana winter fire, how to build the initial layer of kindling to create a draft before laying the heavier wood, how to judge the moisture content of the split oak by sound rather than touch, how long a properly built fire in that particular stone fireplace would hold heat without attention through the night. She learned to treat Rosie's feet when the frozen ground worked a crack between the cloven hooves, cleaning it carefully each morning with a solution Nell mixed from what she kept in the Rosemary Creek medicine cabinet and binding it with a strip of clean cloth that needed to be changed every 2 days until the tissue closed. Rosie bore this procedure with a resigned tolerance that had moved over the weeks of their shared life from calculation into something closer to trust. Grace's hands changed through the winter. She noticed it in the way she noticed most changes, not at the moment of change but at a moment of stillness, when the accumulated difference had become undeniable. One morning in December, she held them up to the light from the north window and looked at them as objects rather than instruments. The palms had hardened in the places where the tool handles pressed, and the skin on the knuckles had thickened, and the cold had left a permanent slight roughness across the back of each hand that no amount of salve fully resolved. She thought about the hands she had arrived with, not with regret, with the recognition that a body adapts to what it is asked to do, and that this adaptation is not damage, but record. Her back had changed as well in a different way. The pain of the first weeks, which had been the pain of muscles asked to do work they were not conditioned for, had evolved into something more honest, a tiredness that responded to sleep rather than persisting through it, the fatigue of a body that had learned its work and was doing it rather than arguing with it. January brought the low gray fog that settled over the county for days at a time, the mountains entirely invisible, and the distances compressed to what the immediate field could hold. Grace had been delaying a particular walk for weeks, though she could not have said exactly why. Perhaps she had wanted everything else to be in order first. Perhaps she understood without quite articulating it that some things deserve to be approached only when you are ready to receive what they actually are rather than what you have imagined them to be. She went to the spring on a January morning when the fog was thick and the slate rock face was dark with collected moisture. She walked through the old orchard past the boundary wall to the southern edge of the property. The basin was full and moving, the water coming steadily from the fissure in the rock face, the way it came year-round, indifferent to season and fog and the human schedules that organized themselves around it. She crouched at the edge and put her hand under the flow. The cold of it moved up through her wrist and settled in her forearm, and she stayed there without moving, looking at the water run over her fingers. And she thought about what 32 years of registration meant. It meant Walter Crane had been 41 years old, had looked at this water emerging from this rock on a piece of land he had worked for over a decade, and had understood that the value of it was exactly as large as the drought that would eventually come, and that the right response to that understanding was not to hoard it, but to formalize it in a way that protected the community around it. She stayed crouched at the spring longer than she had intended. When she stood, the cold had worked into her knees, and the fog had thickened further, and the farmhouse was not visible from where she stood, but she knew exactly how to walk back to it. That knowing was the kind that did not need visibility to operate. When she came through the gate, Nell was sitting at the table under the oak tree with a cup of coffee in both hands, looking out toward the fog-covered pasture. She had let herself in, as she had begun to do sometime in November, without either of them making an occasion of it. On the table was an enameled tin that Grace recognized as the same one Nell had carried on the first morning, but this time, when she lifted the cloth, the contents were not soup. It was a small round of cheese, pale and firm, with the pressed surface that indicated it had been made correctly. Nell said it was from her first batch, following the method Grace had shown her 3 weeks ago, after the process had passed from student to habit. Grace sat down across from her and poured her own cup from the pot Nell had brought out and set it down on the table between them. She looked at the cheese that Nell had made from what she herself had learned, the knowledge completing a circuit whose shape she had not anticipated when she arrived in October, with a rope-bound trunk and a handkerchief of savings. They sat without talking for a while, looking out at the fog together, and the quiet between them was the kind that only exists between people who no longer need to fill it because they have filled it enough times already that the emptiness has become a form of presence. Rosie gave birth in March, on a night when the temperature had risen enough to suggest spring, but not enough to promise it. Grace had been unable to sleep from the middle of the evening, restless, with a feeling she could not locate in any specific worry, only a general alertness, a sense of something in motion. She went to the pen at 2 a.m. with the flashlight and stood at the gate without entering. She waited in the cold and the dark, and sometime in the middle of the 3rd hour, she heard the sounds that indicated the process had concluded, and she raised the flashlight, and there were 2 kids, small and already moving with the urgent purposefulness of creatures who have arrived hungry and intend to make that known immediately. Rosie attended to them without looking up at Grace. Her focus was complete, the ancient and self-sufficient competence of an animal doing what she had done before and needed no assistance or audience to do again. Grace stood at the gate and did not go in and did not make a sound, and what she felt holding the flashlight in the cold March dark was something that the word pride does not quite reach. It was the specific sensation of having cared well for a living thing over a long period of time, and watching that thing respond with a generosity that exceeded the original investment. She named the kids Button and Chip, not by decision, but by the gradual accumulation of observation over the first 2 weeks, the names arriving through noticing, rather than choosing. Spring moved through the county in the particular way it moved in that part of Montana, not all at once, but in a series of small advances and retreats, the temperature climbing for 3 days and then dropping back for 2, the snow retreating from the lower elevations while the mountain peaks held it, the light lasting longer in the evenings in increments too small to track on any single day, but unmistakable over the course of a month. The Saturday gathering under the oak had been going for 3 months by the time the apple trees began to show new growth. What had started with Nell and 2 women from the upper road had grown into something that no one had organized and no one fully controlled, which was probably why it worked. Each week someone new appeared at the open gate drawn by the presence of others rather than by any announcement, and each week the collection of things on the table grew. Grace's cheese alongside preserves and dried herbs and vegetables from gardens that had been tended through winter and were now yielding the first results of that attention. Walt Briggs came one Saturday morning with Tommy beside him. He was a quiet man, considerably older than his son, suggested he should be with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to occupy as little space as possible in situations he does not control. He set a bag of dried beans on the table and stood looking at it for a moment. Then he looked at Grace and said 2 words, "Thank you." He said it the way people say things they have been holding for a long time, with the weight of the holding still in it. Grace said she had not done it. She said Walter Crane had done it 32 years ago, and she had only found what he left. Walt Briggs looked at her for a moment and then looked at the table. He nodded once and went to stand beside his son. A Sunday morning in May arrived, with the sky so clear after 3 days of rain that the mountains to the west were visible in every ridge and snow line, the kind of visibility that feels like a gift because it does not come often. Grace came out of the house with her coffee and sat on the stone bench she had placed under the oak tree sometime in March, when the ground had softened enough to work. The goats were audible in the pen, each one distinct. Rosie's low, steady presence, Button and Chip with their high, overlapping calls that had not yet settled into the cadences of adult animals, Fidget's short, impatient sounds, Shadow almost silent, as always close to Rosie, the Colonel, which was what Grace had started calling the male without thinking about it, eating alone in the far corner with the dignity of an animal that has decided company is unnecessary. She sat with her coffee cooling in her hands and thought about the people who had made the preceding months possible and the people who had made them necessary. She thought about Daniel with the particular quality of thought that grief takes when enough time and work have passed over it. Not the acute presence of loss, not the raw daily absence, but something more textured. She thought about the particular way he had laughed at things he found genuinely funny, rather than socially expected to find funny, the difference that had been entirely his own. She thought about how grief changes shape without diminishing, and that the change of shape is not a betrayal of the original weight, but an accommodation of it, the way a tree grows around an obstacle rather than being stopped by it. She thought about Roy, and the thinking had none of the heat in it that it had carried in the first months. What remained was something more useful, a clear-eyed understanding that some people are not capable of giving what others need not, because they are malicious, but because they are bounded in particular ways, and that those boundaries are not anyone's fault, but they are also not a reason to stay within them. She thought about Walter Crane at length. She thought about a man she had never met, whose handwriting she knew better than that of most people she had known in person, the tight, consistent script of the ledger, the careful dating of every transaction, the water rights filing with its community provision, a piece of foresight so deliberate and so quietly radical that it had sat in a county courthouse for 3 decades without anyone fully understanding what it contained until a woman from Missoula opened a box she found behind a fireplace. She thought about what it meant to leave something like that for a stranger. It required a particular kind of faith, not faith in a specific person, but faith that the right person would eventually arrive and that the right person would know what to do. Walter had not known Grace Holloway would come. He had only known that someone would, and he had prepared accordingly. She thought about Nell, the enameled tin on the first morning, the 312 acres, and Robert and the years since, the patience with which she had transmitted every piece of practical knowledge, not as instruction, but as participation, standing in the pen or at the kitchen table, and showing rather than explaining, trusting that the body learns what the mind sometimes resists. Nell had arrived at Grace's gate that first morning carrying food and information and the very particular gift of being present without requiring anything in return, and that gift Grace had come to understand was not small. For someone who had spent the previous 10 months learning to expect very little from the people around her, it had been the thing that made everything else possible. She thought about Tommy Briggs with something approaching affection for a person whose situation she had recognized without having to be told about it. The position of someone caught between what they witness and what they can safely say, and who chooses finally to act from the former rather than the latter. She thought about Walt Briggs standing at the table with his bag of dried beans and his 2-word expression of a year's worth of difficulty and relief. She thought about Harold Finch with his hands flat on his desk and his unhurried attention, his offer of deferred payment made without drama, his understanding that access to legal competence should not be determined solely by the ability to pay for it in advance. The coffee had gone cold while she was thinking. She finished it anyway, looking out over the yard with the particular quality of attention that belongs to someone who no longer needs to check whether the thing is real, because they have been learning it with their hands for months. The pen was in order. The cheese operation had moved from experiment to small regular income. The old orchard's first pruned branches had been cut in February, and the trees had responded in March, with new growth at every cut point, confirming that Nell's guidance had been sound. The kitchen garden was in and growing. The spring at the southern edge was documented, protected, and now formally available to 3 households through the county petition that Harold Finch had filed in February on behalf of Walt Briggs and 2 neighboring families. The farmhouse had not changed in any of its fundamental proportions. The walls were still the original stone. The roof still carried the slight sag on the north side. The wooden door still required a firm pull to close properly, but the ash had been cleared from the fireplace and the chimney drawn clean. The cabinet held more than 2 clay pots. The window shutters had been repaired. The grapevine over the front path had been cut back and trained, and in the spring growth, it was producing regular intervals of new shoots that indicated it intended to continue. The land had not changed either. It was still 40 acres of dry Montana grassland with a small stone farmhouse and a stone fence pen and a well and an old orchard and a spring on the southern edge. But the land had a working knowledge of Grace's hands now in the way that ground takes on the memory of work done to it, and Grace had a working knowledge of the land in the way that a person becomes capable of reading a place after enough seasons of close attention. She stood from the stone bench and carried her cup inside and rinsed it at the basin and set it on the shelf. She put on her work coat and her boots and went out to the pen. Rosie was at the gate when she arrived, which had become the habit of mornings, the old doe standing at the pen gate with her particular expression of someone who has been waiting but is too dignified to make a production of it. Button and Chip moved immediately to Grace's legs. Shadow held back near the older animal until Rosie moved, then followed. Fidget was already at the feed trough before Grace had the gate fully open. The Colonel continued his independent breakfast in the far corner. Grace filled the trough and checked the water and worked through the morning tasks with the economy of motion that develops when you have done the same sequence enough times that the body knows what comes next without asking. The knowledge that had seemed impossible in October was now simply what she did, the way breathing is what you do. There is a kind of ownership that appears on paper and a kind of ownership that does not. The paper kind was in the trunk inside the farmhouse in a waterproof envelope alongside Walter Crane's ledger and the water rights document and Harold Finch's letter of resolution. It was real and it mattered, and she was grateful for every page of it. But the other kind had no document and required no witnesses. It was the kind that comes from a body that has learned a place through its hands and its back and its feet, that has moved through every part of the land in every season and knows where the ground is soft in the spring and where it holds firm in the winter, and what sound the pen gate makes in the wind, and how long it takes for the fireplace to warm the main room on a cold morning with the right wood. It was the kind where a person and a piece of ground become part of each other's working knowledge, and neither is quite the same as it would have been without the other. Grace had arrived at this property with a rope-bound trunk and 7 years of savings and a grief she was still in the middle of, and no plan that extended past the next decision. She had found 4 hungry goats and a box behind a fireplace and a neighbor at the gate with an enameled tin of soup, and she had stayed. She had learned what staying required, piece by piece, season by season, her hands providing the evidence that her mind had sometimes been too cautious to accept. She had learned that rebuilding is not the restoration of what existed before. It is the construction of something that could not have existed without every prior loss, without every hard season, without every door that closed, without warning, and every night in a strange place where every sound needed classifying before the body would allow sleep. The new thing is built from all of it, and it is sturdier for that because its materials are real. Nell appeared at the gate mid-morning, which was when she usually appeared, with the unhurried consistency of someone who has organized their life around what matters rather than around what is urgent. She came through with a covered basket and set it on the table under the oak without announcing what was in it. Grace finished with the pen and came across the yard. Nell had poured 2 cups from the pot on the stove and set them out. She sat with her hands around her cup, looking at the mountains to the west, which were clear and close in the May light. They sat in the good quiet of people who have run out of things they need to explain to each other, which is a different kind of silence than the silence of people who have nothing to say. The mountains were lit along their upper edges with the particular quality of late morning light that makes permanent things look new. The goats were audible from the pen. Somewhere on the upper road, a vehicle moved slowly past without stopping. Grace held her cup and looked out at the property and thought about Walter Crane one more time. She thought about the specific act of faith involved in hiding something carefully and trusting that the right hands would find it. She thought about how that faith had traveled across 32 years and landed by the particular chain of small chances and large decisions that makes any life in her hands. She thought about what you do with faith that someone else placed in the ground for you. You honor it by staying and by working and by leaving the gate open on Saturday mornings so that whoever needs a place can find one. There are people who receive a second chance and hold it loosely waiting to see if something better arrives. There are people who receive one with mud on their boots and dried milk on their sleeves and the beginning of calluses on both hands, and they close their fingers around it and they do not let go. Grace had not known anything about goats when she arrived. She had not known how to make cheese or argue a property claim before a lawyer or read a water table or prune an apple tree that had been neglected for 3 seasons. She had known one thing, the same thing she had known on the bus from Missoula and in the notary's office in Harlow and on the last stretch of road with the trunk scraping behind her. She had known there was no place to go back to, and sometimes that is the thing that teaches you most completely who you are, not the presence of a safety net, but the clear knowledge that there is none, and the discovery of what you do with your hands and your attention and your refusal to stop in the absence of one. She finished her coffee. Nell did not move to leave. Grace did not prompt her to. The morning had enough in it still, and neither of them was in a hurry to be done with it.